Homegrown terrorism presents a major threat to many NATO countries and their populations. Attacks have already caused multiple injuries, damage and death in countries such as Norway, the UK and the US. So what can NATO do about it? To find out, we asked NATO's counter-terrorism expert, Dr. Juliet Bird. Having worked on sensitive projects previously, we are unable to show her face.
Juliet Bird, can you tell me how much of a new concept is homegrown terrorism?
That's a really good question because I think it's probably an extremely old concept. I think the difference is now that terrorism has moved away from home. Terrorism would be to fight for a cause, and your cause would usually be found on your doorstep. I think the change in the ways that we can communicate have meant that only now do you have a picture of what's happening elsewhere, and therefore the need or the desire to get involved in struggles that are not close to you physically.
As the world becomes more transnational with easier transfer of knowledge and people, does this increase the risk of homegrown terrorism?
Certainly the internet is a tool for everybody, and there's no reason why we should assume that it's used in any different fashion by terrorist groups. It's a huge library of information. It's a great way to reach out across the world to people who think like you do. And even if there are only maybe 5 or 6 in the world who think like you do, you feel you automatically have a community.
How important is actually being physically part of a community to the homegrown terrorist?
The bonding issue is probably more important than what can be taught by being in a training camp or being with those who feel the same way as you. It's the ability to discuss the ideology, the reason that you want to take up weapons and do violence to the people you live amongst, that is what brings you together.
What role can NATO play in addressing homegrown terrorism?
Well, fundamentally, NATO is not a lead player, especially since we're talking about homegrown terrorism. There couldn't really be anything more domestic than that. So that makes it an issue for law enforcement, for intelligence agencies, for the government as a whole to decide what it's going to do about its own domestic problem. So there's not a great deal NATO can do actively about that. It can ensure that the things that have been learnt by different nations are shared.
How successful have we been at doing this in NATO?
Once a year, NATO as a whole produces an agreed threat assessment, and that sets out what it understands the threat to be. And it's from this document that the policy flows. And policy guidelines were given to us at the Chicago summit recently, and we will be turning those into action areas for different parts of the wider NATO.
And they include what areas, for example?
They include everything really, from education and training of both allies and partners to recognise terrorism when they see it, to know what areas NATO is capable of working against, where it can contribute, who else is active in the field and should be looked to for expertise. It can be having the right capabilities to be able to resist attacks using improvised explosive devices, or perhaps how to harden your aircraft to be more resistant to the use of man-pads. It can be the soft side, it can be consultations, it can be the hard side, it can be physical capabilities, and it can be building the capacity of partners and being part of the global effort to counter terrorism. The point is, I think, that international organisations of themselves can do very little, but as part of an international global counter-terrorism strategy, which is what the UN has in place and now monitors the application of, it can be a useful player.